Well, anyway, thank you very much for being here. As Jane did the basic welcome, the good welcome to everyone being here. On behalf of everyone at Bay, we are particularly delighted in having helped get Rachel Kushner back to Seattle on the occasion of this extraordinary new novel of hers, Creation Lake. The fourth novel she's written. Yeah, there is. It's come. In a body of work that's began with Telex from Cuba, was followed by the Flamethrowers, and then the Mars Room, and now Creation Lake, with an extraordinary collection of essays, The Hard Crowd, and there was a gem of a book of stories, The Strange Case of Rachel Kay, all along the way. The book that she's here for tonight has been out now for a few weeks, and as Rachel's been traveling around, and I have a feeling that tonight some of you who are here have read it, so that makes a nice different sense of the exchange, because the book has really been getting read by people. It's a book that is set in France, in a rural area, and the narrator is a woman who has assumed identity, and through the reading of it, the book, there is so much going on with her and her characterization of the people she's seeking to be entwined with and subvert ultimately, in terms of what this group is doing. But it's a brilliant book that I think is one of those books that reads the reader as well as the reader reading it, in terms of who you are as a reader and how a story is told. This is something that has characterized her work through all the novels and the essays. Her work, in terms of its honors and distinctions, has received the Prix Medici, and she's been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, twice for the National Book Award, and now for the Booker Prize previously, and then this year she is shortlisted for Creation Lake. So there's that recognition for what's a substantial body of work, but it's also, I think, I can't think of any other writer of her generation that's received that kind of award distinction to date. With her is Phil Neal, who comes to us from nearby, the author of an extraordinary book called Hinterland, which came out in 2018, the subtitle of which is America's New Landscape of Class and Conflict. And it's a brilliant book that I think Rachel will be talking about if Phil himself doesn't, as in the course of things he writes about. He's a geographer who is at work on something else that we may also hear about. And I think I don't know if he's done anything publicly with any of the books here to date, but with any of his work to date, but it's a pleasure to have him here with Rachel as well. This is a work deeply informed by political activity and awareness and knowledge, and I think that's also something that's Rachel's work is infused with. So again, there'll be a signing afterwards, and with that, for everyone at Elliott Bay and the Seattle Public Library and the Public Library Foundation, thank you for being here. And now please join in welcoming Rachel Kushner with Phil Neal.
I pressed my button. Did you press yours?
I pressed mine, but I don't know. Is that working? Yeah. All right.
Is it on? Can you guys hear us? Okay.
All right. And so did you want to just start right with the reading?
Yeah, sure. First, yeah, thank you, Rick. Thanks, Elliott Bay. Thanks everyone coming. And thank you, Phil, for doing this event with me.
Thank you for coming up.
I wrote him cold and asked, but I'm also a fan of his work. Hinterland is a really brilliant book, like Rick said. So I thought it's my excuse to meet Phil. All right. So I was just going to read a couple of rather short passages from this novel, Creation Lake. And in terms of saying anything about it, I mean, for those who haven't read it, the narrator of the book has arrived, or she's in the section I'm going to read, she's on her way to a remote outpost in rural south central western France, to insinuate herself among a group of young people who formed a commune in this village. And she has been hired by like a private consortium of corporate interests to infiltrate these people and basically get them raided by the French state. She's a disgraced FBI agent, and we could talk about the why and what that is, but so that's this part. And the young people in the commune is called Le Moulin, just means the mill. And they are influenced in part, at least, by an elder, a mentor, whose name is Bruno Lacombe. And the other section I'll read is about him and his beliefs. And he is writing long missives to these people, lives mostly underground in a cave on his own property, which is a plot of farmland, and there's a farmhouse on the property. And he's using a computer terminal in the farmhouse. And the narrator, who tells these people and the reader that her name is Sadie, but we don't know her real name, nor do we learn it, has figured out how to hack into his emails. It's 2013 when it was a bit easier to do that. And she's presumably reading them in order to find evidence that he is giving advice and tactics and strategy of sabotage. But she pretty quickly finds that he is not giving evidence of such, and instead talking about the ancient past and asking what clues can we find in prehistory that might indicate a direction that we should be going in terms of the human project having some kind of meaning other than where we've ended up. And he's somebody who I think of as a refugee of the long 20th century, who was very formed by May of 1968, and then came to the conclusion, like others of his generation, that in fact, the factory worker in cities was not truly a revolutionary subject and was just going to take part in the new and exciting consumerism in the, the miraculous rebuild of France in the wake of World War II, the 1950s, quick reindustrialization. And some of these people moved to the countryside with this idea that, in fact, maybe it is the world of the peasants in France that is like the true vein and heart of a kind of resistance and a revolutionary spirit. And some of those people were disillusioned and find that farming is actually quite difficult, and they don't necessarily have that much in common with the farmers in terms of sharing a set of goals and a horizon line. And Bruno, when this novel begins, it takes place over about 6 weeks' time, has decided that capitalism is absolutely here to stay, but has his own concept that he has worked out over many years of revolutionizing consciousness and turning inward. And it's a notion of leaving this world while remaining in it. So anyway, that's the Bruno section. But first is the narrator, Sadie. I am a better driver after a few drinks, more focused. Instead of trying to read my phone or put on lipstick, after several glasses of wine, I faced forward and held the wheel with both hands. Drink lulled me into doing only what I was supposed to, drive this car, except that I decided toll roads were going to put me to sleep, so I opted for a scenic route on secondary roads. I got lost winding through the Massif Central and its gear-grinding turns. Sure, I was reckless with the clutch, but it's hard for me to feel that rental cars have value. This one, a small hatchback Skoda, cost €8 a day. The Skoda was clean diesel, an oxymoron that was a metaphor for something, but I didn't know what. clean diesel, clean coal. Add the word clean and boom, it's clean. My navigation was off and the scenic route took me way too scenically over a summit. I passed a tower on a cliff, its top edges eaten away like a sugar cone. At that point when the ice cream is gone and the child is contractually obliged to take bites of its tasteless container. God damn it, I said. These breathtaking vistas were unappealing because they confirmed I was lost. I wanted only an indication by this point that I was headed northwest toward the city of Boulier. I saw no signs for Boulier. I was in remote forested highlands. I pulled off at the top of a summit into an unpaved lot adjacent to a building, some kind of mountain inn, hoping for directions. The inn was closed, its windows were boarded. It had just rained up here. The air was damp and warm and close like human breath. The lot was crisscrossed with patterned ruts from truck tires. A mist hung in the branches of the low trees beyond the lot, as if a cloud had descended on this mountain and left its ragged parts among the woods. It felt like a place of aftermath where something had happened. I peed in the wooded area beyond the open lot. While squatting, I encountered a pair of women's day-glow orange underpants snagged in the bushes at eye level. This did not seem odd. Truck ruts and panties snagged on a bush. That is Europe. The real Europe is not a posh cafe on the Rue de Rivoli with gilded frescoes and little pots of famous hot chocolate. That's a conception of Europe cherished by certain Parisians and as imaginary as the pastoral scenes on the frescoes of the walls of the posh cafe. The real Europe is a borderless network of supply and transport. It is shrink-wrapped pallets of super-pasteurized milk or powdered Nesquik or semiconductors. The real Europe is highways and nuclear power plants. It is windowless distribution warehouses where unseen men, Polish, Moldovan, Macedonian, back up their empty trucks and load goods that they will move through a giant grid called Europe, a Texas-sized parcel of which is called France. These men will ignore weight regulations on their loads and safety inspections on their brakes. They will text someone at home in their own language, listen to pop music in English, and get their needs met locally in empty lots on mountain passes. The only mystery is where they find the women for these occasions, but even that isn't so hard to imagine. A girl or woman fallen on hard times, not French and without EU documents, stuck in a rural outpost, picking her way out to the main road in impractical high-heeled shoes, aloe in her purse for rapid-fire hand jobs. She left her underwear in these woods, big deal. The panties hanging on a bush in front of my face are a package of 3 for €5 at Carrefour. They're like Kleenex. You sweat or leak or bleed into them and then toss them on a bush or in the trash, or you flush them and clog the plumbing, someone else's plumbing, ideally. I had been drinking, as I said, and I had to go. I was making beer, as a Moldovan trucker might put it. A foaming reservoir filled its makeshift banks on the ground over which I squatted, and then it overflowed those banks, streaming like advanced troops sent downhill on a scouting mission. I was still peeing and watching my pee make its way down the hill when I heard footsteps. I startled. Was someone here? So that's enough of her for right now. And then we'll move on to a little bit of Bruno Lacombe. He'd been in these caves 12 years now, he said, and still he had not gotten to any definable end. The cavern's design instead calling into question the whole concept of an end. Here on Earth is another Earth, he said, a different reality, no less real. It has different rules. You won't understand any of this from me telling you about it. You might even dismiss what I say. For 9/10 of human time on Earth, people went underground. Their symbolic world was formed in part by their activities in caves, by modalities and visions that darkness promised. Then this all ceased. The underground world was lost to us. The industrial uses of the earth, the digging, fracking, tunneling, are mere plunder and do not count, Bruno said. Modern people who build bomb shelters planning to survive some version of apocalypse also do not count, he said. Yes, they go underground, but not in mind of a human continuum, a community. They think, I'll be the clever one, the one who survives mass death. But why would you want to survive mass death? What would be the purpose of life if life were reduced to a handful of armed pessimists hoarding canned foods and fearing each other? In a bunker, you cannot hear the human community in the earth, the deep cistern of voices, the lake of our creation. In my cave, he said, under my cave, welling up from deeper passages, I hear so many things, not just the drip of water. I hear voices, people talking, like right now. Sometimes it's in French, sometimes Occitan or older tongues of the Languedoc, many languages I do not recognize, sounds of which I cannot understand a word, but I know that what I hear is humans. It is human talk. Did we always have language? We don't know the answer to this. Linguists try to chart what they call glottochronologies. They picture language like a tree with a trunk, the first language at the base of the trunk being simple and common, what some call nostratic. This is a fantasy, but who can refute them? They can't escape the chains of their telos, the sad idea that they are the logical outcome, the advanced form of human speech. They never imagine that if language is a tree, they must look not at its trunk, but at its roots, which, like a tree's roots, might form an upside-down chandelier, reaching and spreading deep into the dark beyond. But most people are unable to grasp how far down the physical world goes, and they wouldn't know that voices are stored in its depths. It's hard to explain, he said. You would have to have lived as I live, done what I've done, learned what I've learned in order to hear what I hear. You would need a different mind. When you live underground, among the things you discover is that you're in a world richly peopled, occupied by legions. Homo erectus, who stood up and cooked, Bruno said, he is here. Homo neanderthalensis, who huddled modestly and dreamed expansively, here. Homo sapiens, gone into caves to paint, to render his capture with extra legs, extra horns, so that these beasts canted and ran over caved walls, or butted heads, clashed and fought, all in the light of a torch. H. Sapiens' underground cinema house. That resourceful and ruinous forebear of ours, he is here. Cathars and other heretics, the few not slaughtered, gone deep, living in darkness. Yes, present. Cagot, after the war of 1594, hiding to survive, surviving in secret here. Cavers, 19th century men and boys killed by curiosity, fallen in, unable to make their way out here. The partisans, men of my own boyhood, who retreated underground to hide from rampaging Germans, they too are here. For a long time, he said, you can't tune in. Then you might sense a current or buzz of energy. This sound transforms the more time you spend in caves. It becomes voices. You hear these voices, but are unable to isolate them. It takes years to learn how to listen, to differentiate, to adjust your inner tuner to a position on the atemporal bandwidth of the underground world. Remember shortwave transmission, he asked them. Probably you don't, he answered. Tuning into shortwave programming used to be an art. Depending on the bandwidth, it worked best at night. There was a book, he said, that listed program by calendar schedule and megahertz. You learned to listen for where to put the dial, to hear a Bulgarian choir or news from Senegal or Venezuela's Radio Juventud. Shortwave is real, of course, he said. It is also a metaphor. I bring it up not to reminisce over dead technologies, but to help you understand. Cave frequencies, he said, are not 3 to 30 megahertz. Cave bandwidth crosses moments, eras, epochs, eons. You have to learn to get inside the monophony, to tease it apart. Eventually, you encounter an extraordinary polyphony. You begin to sort, to filter. You hear whispers, laughter, murmurs, pleas. There's a feeling that everyone is here, a wonderful feeling, I should add, because suddenly you realize how alone we have been, how isolated, to be trapped, stuck in calendar time and cut off from everyone who came before us. I never want to be that alone again, he said. So that's it for the reading. And then, thanks.
I just have to say that that section I think was actually my favorite little bit of the book personally. So serendipitous that you chose that one. And it was also a little serendipitous when you asked me to do this event and I read the book. At first I wasn't sure why, you know, but then I received the book and I started reading, and there was a series of little things that kind of happened, a series of little hidden frequencies, just like in this passage, where we hear these kind of echoes of things. I think this book, it touches, it hits close to home for a lot of us here in the Pacific Northwest, given the nature of the narrator, right? Of this disgraced FBI agent involved in something kind of Green Scare adjacent. And any of us here know that the Green Scare is, you know, this was kind of the heart of it in the US. We may know people, you know. So let's start with that narrator, that decision to have this this initial narrator. And I'll explain why I say initial narrator in a moment, but the explicit narrator of the book. So what was your thinking behind this approach, having this type of a character, maybe not quite an anti-hero, but a cynical or you know, the bad guy for many people. So what was their thinking behind that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I've had different thoughts about it, you know, since writing the book, like just trying to get sort of a purchase on like how that evolved and worked for me, because when you're writing, you're following instincts. And then after you produce the thing and sort of see what people's reactions are, you start to understand more deeply your own motivations for something. I mean, so initially, and probably basically since 2008, I had the idea that eventually I might write a book set among young people in France who are on a collision course with the French state. And there's, you know, some pretty explicit precedent for that, you know, not just the most obvious one being like Tarnac and Northern Corrèze, but some other places in France. But I didn't really know how to do it. And it's a tricky thing to talk about, but I'll just, you know, I will think out loud and be as candid as I can. Having an understanding of the kind of politics and the social mores and the struggles of people living communally felt like an act of betrayal if I were to just put that into fiction. And for what purpose, you know? Because novels as a space require, if I can borrow like a Lacanian term, they require that the narrative and the characters, and maybe the author as well, traverse some kind of fantasy. And so if the narrator were someone like me, who had values like mine, who was basically more or less quite sympathetic to a character like Bruno and to these young people who are trying to farm rurally, her trajectory might be one, I don't know what it would be, but the obvious one would kind of be like she would get there and try to cathect and maybe would get rejected eventually, which I've seen happen a couple times to people. You know, they come home. I didn't want it to be a book about disillusionment. And there is a kind of haze of paranoia that have floated over some groups of friends, and for very good reason, because they have been infiltrated by narcs. And so you know, there'd been this question in my mind, and you mentioned Green Scare, and like, you know, there's the most obvious one of the woman who had entrapped Eric McDavid. And when that happened, it was hard not to be curious about the kind of person who could do that. And so I started asking myself just about her, like, so for people who don't know, you know, just to give the most vague lineaments, like there've been FBI agents who've decided that infiltrating leftist activists is a useful activity, as though, you know, people who protest in front of a power plant are a genuine and serious threat to the energy sector. And when evidence of sabotage is not produced, and people are getting pressure from their supervisors, they will produce that evidence. And in this one case, this guy was interested in a romantic relationship with this woman, and she made him understand that it was part and parcel of their courtship that they would plan an act of sabotage together. And he ended up getting convicted and charged, sentenced to 21 years in federal prison, and served 9 of those years, I think, before his conviction was overturned. And so I kept asking myself, what kind of a person would do that? And not in that rhetorical manner of outrage, but more like, what is the mindset? And then there was the case of Mark Kennedy, AKA Mark Stone, who infiltrated some, among the many people, some personal friends, who was a UK police officer infiltrating leftist groups in, I think it was Germany, France, and England. And that case became a kind of a sort of shambolic tabloid, fait divers. And he was caught by some of the people that he was surveilling, who found passports in his glove box that had his picture and multiple names. And what I was told was that and I don't know if this is true or not, but it's generative for me. So in a way, it doesn't really matter if it's actually true. I think I read it in the Daily Mail, which is a very reliable publication. But when he was surrounded by people when they found the passports, sort of like, hey, what's up with this? And apparently he, started to cry and said, like, I don't even know who I am. I'm so confused. I'm with you guys and I'm stuck in this existential quandary because I don't know what to do. And he was crying, but blubbering about smashing the state. And I could imagine that these people probably, were ready to jump him. And he saved himself in that moment and then disappeared. And was hired by a military contractor that was called Blackwater. I think I read that in the UK Sun, which is also a very reliable publication. But so like I had been thinking about this book for years, and I didn't have a narrator. I didn't have somebody who had access to Brunel and had access to the commune, and it just unfolded. And sometimes there is a quotient of mystery to the how and the why. But the first 2 sentences of the book the first 2 sentences I wrote were the first 2 sentences of the book verbatim, unchanged, which is, he said, Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. And I knew that it was this woman transposing those lines for the reader. And pretty quickly, I realized that she was like an enemy force that was on her way to the territory to disrupt and to ruin other people's lives. And I thought, okay, well, who is she? Like what kind of person does entrap people and try to send them to prison? And it became clear to me that in order to answer that question, I had to peel back the layers, but all of the layers were like onion skin layers, where she was just presenting prior guises and aliases of hers and had this kind of origin myth that I sort of took from the case of poor Eric McDavid, which is, she's working for the FBI and she entraps this guy who has, hot pants for her. And it's like, yes, we will sleep together, but first you will buy 500 pounds of nitrate fertilizer, And then his lawyer is able to prove an entrapment defense, and she gets fired, and the kind of windows of this federal agency, just go up, like the tinted windows go up, and that's it. And so it's a kind of, in a way, like a classical structure to begin with a detective who has lost their original raison d'etre, which was like, if you think it's prideful to work for the FBI, fine, I don't. But she is resentful and angry at them for causing her to have lost her job. And it doesn't occur to her that that she set out to ruin these people's lives. So it's like she just became, for me, somebody who could bear the load of being bestowed with traits that were totally alien to me. And it almost became like a sport for me. Like I would just give her every quality that I don't myself possess. Like even right down to, she thinks it's a character weakness if people are vulnerable to mosquito bites. And like if there's a mosquito, I'll just have lumps all over my face, you know, and I can't ride backwards on a train. She has this sort of relationship that she's manipulated this guy into only for the purpose of strategically attaching herself to this group, because he's the childhood friend of the de facto leader and they're on a TGV together and he's riding backwards and kind of like turning green and is about to puke. And she's just looking at him like an entomologist would look at a specimen. And so she has this kind of like machine-like strength that I do not possess. I'm, you know, more of a fragile flower. And so, yeah, and so that was just kind of how she developed. She's not me.
Well, and in a way, she comes off almost as kind of like a dark mirror of the reader as well. There's this, I said, sort of like a cynical cast to the narration, but also almost like not quite a hollowness, but like you really never quite get a sense of who she, really is, or what
Yeah.
she's even really thinking about any of this stuff that she's doing. And it's a very unsettling feeling in many ways when you kind of read it, and because you see these certain reflections, but they're these dark reflections of things that we all do at work, right? And in these certain settings. But then throughout the book, there's also this very interesting structure, and this is sort of an element of the writing craft as well. I think this is very well written in this like craft sense, because it's very hard to do this with a book, but you do it very well. Almost having this kind of hidden narrator come through in this kind of magnetism underneath in the subterranean space in the book. And then by the time you're done reading it, you kind of have to think, actually, was she the narrator at all? Was she the main character, right? So your pairing in the initial reading has these two characters, right?
Yeah,
So let's talk a little bit about the second character, about Bruno,
Yeah.
who sort of comes out as, for anyone who hasn't read the book, he's almost exclusively discussed through these just emails that are read by the narrator who has hacked into his email account. So this very kind of distant thing. But also ostensibly, as we heard in the reading, is like down in these caves. So it's kind of like could be anywhere under you at any time, right?
yeah.
So it's this very interesting kind of feeling. And there's this magnetism that forms as you read the book. There's this draw where you start to think, oh, actually, this is very interesting. Like I'm more and more engaged in these things that this guy is sending in his emails, right? And the narrator also is kind of drawn in, has
Yes,
this
she is.
strange feeling. So with this character, Bruno, what is your approach with regard to him? How did that character kind of form, and how did this relationship between, or not really a relationship because they don't really meet, but this distant thing, how did that really come to take shape in your mind?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, and for reading the book so closely. So Bruno, well, one image I had early on was of this man, this elder, as I've described him to you, pressing his ear against a rock wall and hearing something like the susurrations of what I was thinking of as shortwave transmissions. I don't know, I had a shortwave radio when I was young, and I was really into kind of dialing in at night. And I used to think about radio waves as sort of like detaching and floating free. I remember being in the car as a child, my parents had on AM radio, and they were saying like, we think this is like a transmission that was just floating in the, whatever it is, the ionosphere or something, that then came in through the radio. And so I was thinking about like detached messages and somebody being an instrument themselves to receive. And so that was just one image I had. I realized more recently in doing these events, I've been traveling for 6 weeks with the book, that one day in high school, there was a guy in my geometry class who was like, he would just take acid all the time. And he came to school and said that like in his basement, he could hear radio shows through the wall. So that may have been, the origin. But I was interested in this, thinking of Bruno pressing his ear to the rock wall. I was thinking about somebody who wants to find an indication, if you will, of where the wrong turn in the human project was taken. And it's sort of classically considered to be about 12,000 years ago at the dawn of agriculture. And maybe it was a kind of like private joke with myself that Bruno picks up the marker and is like, no, it was 38,000 years ago when Homo sapiens like rampaged across Europe. This is a sort of, simplified play with the realm of prehistory. The time before the written down does lend itself to speculation. But physically, in terms of the space of the cave, I was thinking that he is somebody who believes that he's figured out truly how to merge onto a plane of time that is all planes of time on one plane of time. And some of that comes from my familiarity personally with the geography of this part of France and what it feels like to be in a cave. And not just like the tourist caves that you can go in and see a painting on the wall from Cro-Magnon, but the regular uses of caverns and limestone overhangs and underground structures that have been continually inhabited by humans for 100,000 years. Sometimes you're walking and you just get a drift of people. I've been walking under a limestone overhang and realized I was walking through people's rooms because there are divots on the outside of the cave where people would hang animal skins. And I realized this is an interior private space. And with this character, Bruno, I feel that I was able personally to latch onto his desires and this sense he has of wanting to find indications like clues that previous people might have left for us that we either lost or never found or have but don't know how to decode. And so it was this idea that he is looking to the past. I mean, he says at one point in one of the letters, like, no, I'm not a primitivist, as if in swift defensive answer to a question. He says he's just looking to the past to find clues about the future, which he describes as, that we are careening off of a cliff in a shiny driverless car. And the question is, how do we exit this car? And it seemed like a fair question to me. But as I got into him, he quite readily, for me, sort of opened like a flower, like he had his own personal biography and his childhood. And he has like an original memory, a kind of primal scene, and then there's a screen memory. And it just all unfolded. And maybe it's like my interest in that kind of person and the sort of spaces that he would have moved through in 20th century France. And so it was all kind of right there at the ready for me, and very much in opposition to Sadie, who offers no personal biography. They're just completely, different characters.
Yeah, there's this mirrored structure into it. And then in addition, some of these other kind of serendipitous things that just kind of came to me as I was reading this book. There are these spaces that you're in, like you were mentioning, these kind of hinterland spaces outside what most people conceive of as, what the image of Europe is, these kind of real spaces. And then also, I happen to be from a similar space in the US where there was a lot of back to the land, people doing the same things.
Right.
And one of the classic things you can always tell if you go to anywhere in a little town in the Northwest, you can tell if someone used to be around the kind of hippie commune, if somewhere on their shelf they have a copy of this book, Clan of the Cave Bear.
Yeah,
You
right.
could always tell.
Well, the writer was from my hometown of Eugene, Oregon, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's always, there is this fascination with deep time in these sort of spaces. There's this fascination with kind of return and where this prelapsarianism almost, where did it go wrong? But also time itself plays a very important role here. And I want to also get a chance to ask you this kind of in regard, not just to this book, but also why you chose kind of this period for this book, both contemporary and deep time, and also in the context of the rest of your work. Because, and I don't know if this was intentional, but if you read all of your novels in order, they progressively mirror the present until we
That's
get
right.
to this book. And then we're in the present, but we're also in the deep past, as far back as you can go. So there's a very kind of interesting arc that it's too big of a question, but it has something to do with, we could talk about American hegemony and the history of the 20th century, and because we begin in 1950s Cuba, and then we progress
right.
through these different eras. So why this time period for this book, and why this time period wrapped in deep time in all of human history?
Oh, man, that is a great question. Yeah, I mean, there's this Derridian idea of like keeping or missing an appointment with yourself, like you can finally coincide with yourself. And you're right about my novels. My first novels, the years directly preceding the Cuban Revolution, and it was like, well, I have a personal connection to Cuba because my mother and her sisters partly grew up there in the 1950s, but I also wanted to figure out for myself or ask some questions about this critical epic of the 20th century when national liberations the world over, erupted, many successful. And then I moved to the 1970s with my second novel, The Flamethrowers. And then my third novel is really like the beginning of mass incarceration in California. And I live in California. I live walking distance from the largest criminal court structure in the world. I want to write a contemporary novel. But for me, the contemporary doesn't start like this morning. It starts with like how all of that came to be and what built it and what was the mindset and why is it so mean, and like, why did people that I went to high school with go to prison and then not have a good life the way that I did? And so it was sort of, and then, so and then there's this novel, which is loosely set in 2013, but hearing you talk, I'm, no saint, but I was like picturing myself on my knees the way people kind of travel to Mecca very, very slowly, And it's like, if Mecca is your appointment with yourself, it's like eventually maybe I will coincide with myself and arrive at the contemporary, but I'm getting there slowly because I have to make my way through the warp and weft of these structures of history and how they work, because I'm interested in how people are shaped by the conditions around them, because I know it to be true that that's part of who I am. I'm not, a timeless, like I'm not a subject outside of time who can attach to anyone from any time. I'm in part a product of my own generation. And in terms of 2013, so, I was thinking about the people who were shaped by the anti-globalization movement, as I myself was. And, it's useful to have a milieu and to know other people and to be familiar with what they care about. Like, that's just what you write about. You write about worlds for which you have stakes, you have a little skin in the game. So I was thinking about people who would have been formed by some of this, and maybe like made paranoid by some of it, like some of the reprisals that happened for people. And I wanted it also to be contiguous with what happened in Tarnac in late 2008. And for people who don't know, the French state raided a commune in the northern Corrèze, like around Christmas time before dawn, in full paramilitary gear, and then impounded a library of something like 3,000 books as evidence against these people. That case was eventually thrown out after a very long time, moving its way through the court system in France. But I wanted to pick a time that was sort of continuous with that era of paranoia that had produced. And my novels take place in time, and 2013 didn't matter that much, but because I needed to choose a time, I was thinking about my narrator goes to Marseille with the guy that he believes he's in a relationship with her. She says he's in love with a woman who doesn't exist because, she's not herself with him and the whole thing is fake for her. They go to Marseille and the song Get Lucky by Daft Punk is playing everywhere. Like it's in the taxi, it's in the train station, it's in the hotel lobby, in the restaurant, in the bar, in the club, in the pharmacy, at the beach. Being, amplified from a motorcycle driving by. And that is what Marseille was like in the summer of 2013. Not every summer gets a song, by the way. But that summer did. And so then I thought, oh, it's 2013, because that's when that song had its debut. But when I finished writing the book, I kind of felt, and not to pat myself on the back, but I felt like it kind of slid into the now, like going down a water slide and splashing into the water. No pun intended, but this issue in the book of water, which is there's a project of industrial farming interests in cooperation with the Ministry of Rural Coherence are taking water out of the water table and planning to store it in these enormous plastic lined bays. They're called mega basins. And they're, we love the unit of the football field. I guess it's like 4 to 6 football fields. And I had seen a reference to those, like just in a French news report. And I didn't think that much about it, except that I wanted my people to have an issue that is very specific to the 6 weeks, like discrete time period of the novel. And I spent a lot of time in a part of France where they're just growing a lot of corn. And it's not traditionally what's grown there. It requires a ton of water. It's like foie gras can seem like the regional delicacy in any part of this huge swath of France because it's profitable. So I made it the issue. And then when I was finishing the novel, it had become a huge issue in France, more in the Northwest, but suddenly there were these pitched battles between farmers and on their side activists, and then French police, like quite violent. And now there's this movement, the Soulèvement de la Terre. So that was kind of interesting. So I sort of feel like it's making its way into the now.
Yeah, it's very slowly approaching. There's kind of an angel of history vibe to it, where we're watching everything behind us, and we feel like we're getting closer, but it's also just, it keeps approaching, and you have this feeling like it's right behind you, but you don't quite know what it is yet. And that's, I think that gives a good kind of tone to the novel. Do we have to switch it up? Right? Yeah. Okay. I think that we covered the main ones. I think we can switch to the audience. I know some of these people in the audience. I know they're going to ask some of the other questions I would have asked. So
Cool.
I think
I'm
that
happy
makes
to
sense.
answer them.
Okay, so we'll have mics running on both sides, so people just want to raise their hand and we'll come bring a mic to you. You've got a question? Anyone up there?
Oh, that's working.
It didn't sound like
Light is
it.
on. Is it? It's not doing anything, is it? Is this one working?
I can project it.
Hmm.
So I'm started a little bit through the book. So what I thought of while I was watching it, I looked it up. There was this podcast that I listened to recently, just in the shower when it came out, but the Michigan plot. And it was about the plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And it was just this nice, journalist, right, left wing, nice, regular. And what they found was unexpected along the way was that it was really the bad guys were kind of stoner hick idiots, and it was the informant and the FBI that were egging them on, and the plot that they eventually came up with was really stupid and would never work anyway. So that's what I kind of thought of, and it's, I don't know, how does that fit in? Who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? I guess one level, but then the other, it's almost like where we are now is what was the left wing in the 60s and 70s, but co-opted by the right wing now, and it's going back in our face, and you're back, it's all reversed. How does that feel?
Oh, I got to think about that. I got distracted because I was remembering, like, my husband calls me Big Rach, and it's a joke about Big Gretch, This is the rapper that got her those Cartier buffs. Who was that? Michigan rapper. I don't really know much about that story, But, you know, I have found in looking into some of these things, like when I think about this guy, Mark Kennedy, the guy working for the Metropolitan UK Police, I get the feeling that there's this kind of scam out there where people are convincing their superiors that like, yes, these people are a genuine threat, like just keep giving me an expense account, you know? Because like people called him Flash because he had access to money. And then, you know, they asked people after the fact, like, well, I asked some people, like, didn't you know this guy was a narc? Because I would look at the pictures of him and he just looked like a lost person to me. And, you know, and I've been around these people enough to know, you know, like when you're young and you get stoned and you kind of can see through the masks and you're like, oh my God, like oh. Well, now no one, wait, is my microphone still working? Okay, it was mention of being stoned. I don't even smoke pot. But like, you know, when you're young and you suddenly can sort of, no, it's not working. Really? Okay. Oh, it's just because I wasn't talking near it. All right. Like when you can sort of see through the mask and see that people don't really know who they are and that they have a very fragile ego formation. I would see these pictures of Mark Kennedy and be like, didn't you guys know? And somebody said to me, well, the thing is that he had a van and, you know, it's like he didn't have a blown radiator or a dead battery. And so he knew how to make himself useful to other people. And, you know, this comes up in the book and Sadie talks about it, like people often will say that they did know, but after the fact they knew. And we're all like that about hindsight. You know, suddenly you can see the structure that was there that a part of your psychology was actively suppressing because it wasn't practical to reject the dude who had a van, you know? And there's been some of these cases like the story of this guy, Bob Lambert. Do people know? But this guy was a professor in the UK who was, you know, surveilling leftist activists and had a child with one. And then from what I understand, the child sued the UK police for having a fictitious father, which is like pretty profound, you know? And then, so Mark Kennedy had these affairs with these women who, from what I understand, sued the UK police and won and got settlements. And Mark Kennedy, I think, countersued the UK police. I also think I read this in the UK Sun, but he countersued for quote unquote, he sued the police for failing to protect him from falling in love. So I don't know about the people in Michigan, but it sometimes seems like it's a very extravagant game of telephone where somebody is like, get me these results, you know? And sorry, one more anecdote that your question reminds me of, and I think it's one of the seeds here, even though my novel is not slapstick. I mean, it was a conduit for certain aspects of my sense of humor, my juvenile sense of humor. But one seed was after 9/11, like when the Patriot Act, you know, came into our lives and really started to kind of fundamentally alter some structures of life for people and structures of feeling in the United States. I heard this story about a guy who was working in Chicago in an office and had a screensaver on his computer of a Jean-Michel Basquiat painting that has a drawing of an airplane going towards the Trade Center. And one of his coworkers called the FBI on him. And the feds came to question this guy. And he also happened to be Black, by the way. But so he was talking to them and they said, tell us about your screensaver. And he said, well, it's a painting, you know, by Jean-Michel Basquiat. And they said, who is this Basquiat? And how do you know him? Any other questions?
Okay,
when I read the narration of Sadie Smith, I have the impression that she is outperforming her duties. She's doing way more than she is expected to do. She knows about everyone in the commune. She's
Yeah.
learning a lot from Bruno Lacombe, who is an invisible person who has been adopted by the commune as a mentor, and following the reference to radio. So yeah, he is mentioning the wavelengths of eons of humans going back to the remotest of times. And I was remembering how I loved tuning into shortwave radio stations from far away, as
Yeah.
far as China when I was a teenager in Venezuela. And so this group of Pascal and the boys from Paris and the women who are working as doing the chores of the commune, the commune, I was associating them as the ones who are reading the emails as a handbook, and not as what Sadie seems to be finding in the text, to the point that on page 189, if I remember correctly, she stopped saying, Bruno said, he said, and then she forgets about telling the story from his perspective, and she begins to tell the story of Bruno.
Right.
And there is no Bruno said anymore
Yeah.
from that page. So what do I want to ask? What else can we learn from Sadie? Because there is this person who is very much into finding details in everything she sees, and it's not needed for, I think, for her report. She doesn't have to tell, she doesn't have to mention the colors of the foliage, the chlorophyll, or the reds of the soil, and the different nuances and the shiny surfaces of the stone. So what is she up to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question and for your observations in reading the book. I mean, one thought I'm having is that there's always a sort of surplus quotient when it comes to sadism and cruelty. You know, you can't calibrate exactly the right amount to hurt other people. There's always going to be some surplus or extra amount. But also, you know, maybe she's a person who it's possible to renovate. I mean, I see her as somebody who is in full ontological crisis over the course of the book, at least for me. In thinking about, and it's not even so much the anonymity. I mean, that is certainly part of it. But for me, the fundamental part of the crisis is that she lives without consequence, without personal consequence. Like, sorry to be a little corny, but I feel like what calibrates my understanding of my own life and my placement here on earth is to try to summon and practice some kind of care. And she doesn't have to do that at all, to the point where literally, you know, she's staying in this country house that belongs to her fake boyfriend's family, Lucien. And she fills this living room with her empty beer cans. She forgets to put her beer in the fridge, so she's cracking a hot one here and there, and like fills the living room with empty beer cans and wine bottles. She drinks quite heavily at first without really acknowledging that much to the reader. And then when that room's full of empties, she just closes the pocket doors and fills the other room with empties. And she says, I never have any reason to clean up my trash because I will never return to any place that I've been. And I think, like, imagine having a life like that. It just, it would feel suicidal, like nothing matters at all. And at a certain point in the book, she says, you people aren't real to me. No one is. So I think that without psychologizing her or sentimentalizing her, I was aware that I had a character who might be uniquely vulnerable to the teachings of a Bruno Lacombe in a way that the people in Vantôme, the Moulinards, are not vulnerable because they each have a fairly formed sense of themselves as an ego formation and as a social identity. And she has neither one of those, and she's very isolated, whoever she is. So when she walks through the landscape and sort of insistently tells the reader that nothing matters to her and that she's not interested in nature, you know, it's like, it's people in nature that scares her. She's suddenly companioned by these features of the landscape that she's read in Bruno's emails, nominally in order to locate whether or not, you know, he is advising tactics of sabotage, but there they are. And so suddenly she's aware of these features and the world is becoming colored in for her by what he says. I mean, she also says that she prefers, you know, men of the generation of, you know, war and prisoners of war and prostitutes of war and, you know, famine and the French Foreign Legion, rather than like these sissies who grew up in the 90s and just want to, like, you know, play their hit songs from their youth for you. And you have to pretend like it matters because that's the price that you would have to pay for having a boyfriend. So there's something romantic for her about this older man. I mean, maybe in a way she considers herself to be something like his spiritual daughter, though she doesn't say that in the book. But he has lost a daughter, and I think she is volunteering herself for that role, even as he doesn't know she exists and they never meet. Any other?
I think we'll do like
questions?
2 more questions.
We've been talking a little bit earlier about the arc of your 4 novels. I started by reading Mars Room, so I was going backwards. But what struck me between Mars Room and then looking at Telex from Cuba was stylistic changes, a very different narrative technique. That is not the kind of thing we've been talking about here, but I wondered if that perception you agree is correct or not, that you have different styles in your different novels, and what does that mean? Why is that?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I would like to think I do have different styles. I feel like each novel presents to the writer or to this writer finally the chance to figure out how to make something that's completely new and that doesn't have any compromises in it. Because there are these moments along the way where we all kind of, like, as a writer, you just sort of can't help but snap to form a little bit to do something. It's like to let the water flow downhill. There are aspects of the 19th century novel that have leaked into, you know, my mentality and my approach to writing without me, you know, really like guarding the boundary. Or it's like things from your childhood, things that you've read influence you in ways that you're not really in control of. And each novel is like this new chance to finally figure out how to cleanly merge the subject with this form. And it's gonna just be pure somehow. That's the only way I know how to describe it. But the longer I've written, maybe the more I don't know, not to say the better I get at changing things up, but I don't know, maybe I feel like I'm more adept now at accessing where the energy is for me. And with this book, it was really about this modulation between having actually 2 tellers, Sadie and Bruno, but kind of combined inside of one voice. And the first 2 lines when I wrote them, I was kind of emulating the voice in this essay film that I really love by Chris Marker, Sans Soleil. Do people know that movie? And there's a British woman narrating, and she's narrating letters that she's received from a fictional character who's an alter ego for Chris Marker called Sandor Krasna. And she says, the first image he told me of was of 3 children on a road in Iceland in 1965. And I was thinking of that, of the he and the she of that, and how for me it's quite entrancing. I really like it. But then quickly, Sadie was a much more brittle and kind of blunt tone than the voice of the woman who narrates that film. But also, I wanted to structure the book with these really short chapters. And I wanted the short chapters to not use white space as a kind of like breathy ellipsis where you take a poetic pause and regroup and then start again. I wanted it to be like a paper cutter, you know, that's just and then move to the next one. And I wanted to see if I could sustain this kind of propulsion with that. But I didn't have any specific models. Like I hadn't found a detective novel with long sermons about how ridiculous it is that we call people Stone Age when it wasn't that they were rock centric or into rocks, but merely that this is just the final unrubbed away nub of what's left of their existence. So I don't know. I just, you know, I love writing. I had a lot of fun writing the book, and maybe that's key to changing up the tone, is just trusting it.
Okay, last question we'll do on this side.
If somebody has a question, you know, that didn't get answered, I can answer it when I sign your book, I'll answer your question.
Hello, I have a question on the your side. So you have this hagiographical narrative of Bruno at the center of this book. And I was wondering how you balanced, because in my own writing, sometimes when I want to take the mythic tone for a character, it gets melodramatic really fast. How do you create the mystery and the myth while maintaining a grounded nature for the characters, so he is believable once as he is kind of ineffable, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right, like how to kind of let him have his flights of fancy without seeming ridiculous. Is that more or less what you're asking? Or melodramatic? I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that sort of, I mean, how I put it was like, or my instinct without having put language to it was like, never to ridicule him. So I didn't feel like the risk was melodrama as much as how to let humor kind of have him be in possession of it and then have it hover outside of him a little bit so that the reader understands that he's producing myths, you know, like I don't know if Bruno completely believes that Neanderthals smoked, for instance. But I think that for me, myth is an interesting structure because we know that myths aren't real. It's their very fictionality that makes them interesting to us. Like we have this sense that, you know, like when you're young and you learn the Greek myths, you know they aren't real, but they serve a very real function, which is to resolve some kind of contradiction or failure, you know, or limit socially or historically. So I was thinking about that kind of, and sometimes, you know, Bruno would have a rant like, he's overcompensating as if talking back to a dominant logic in the culture. Like when I was growing up, you know, we were told, oh, like the Neanderthals just couldn't hack it. So they must have been serious losers. And so then this lost species becomes for Bruno his sort of beautiful loser. And he's always looking to praise the Neanderthal, where normally that praise, would be given to the Homo sapien, like talking about like the exquisite beauty of the paintings in, Lascaux. He says, well, these images are just evidence of a growth at any cost mindset because they exclusively reproduce eating and killing. And for him, it's all about the Neanderthal and abstract art and geometric patterning that's been found on bone and rock. But, I'm secretly thinking not so much of Bruno, but of like the anthropological accounts that I've read of Neanderthal art. I'm interested in abstract art. I'm interested in abstraction because representation does seem to just kind of reproduce how we know the world to already seem. And there's something else there that can be harnessed and pulled in that exists but is unseen. And that's what Bruno praises and sort of romanticizes. But when he talks about the abstract art of the Neanderthal, sometimes I'm thinking of like the marks on my cutting board, like maybe somebody was just sawing on something and was marks underneath. And then people are, they want the Neanderthal to have been an artist. So they find like one mark like this and one like this. And they're like, it's art, he did it also. So I guess it was like playing with Bruno. And in terms of melodrama, I borrowed a couple biographical details from a guy named Jean-Michel Moncion, who was an associate of Guy Debord in the 1950s. He'd been a member of the Lettrist International, kicked out like, everybody was in the era of purges. But he had lost his whole family in World War II. And in his memoir, he's talking about this early memory of his brother falling in a playground in Paris and a doctor setting the bone and putting a metal plate inside. And I borrowed that detail because Moncion says, the plate didn't work. This was early in medical science and they didn't really know how to set a bone. So it like fused the plates of his arm and he couldn't bend it. And he says, but that plate did serve a quite useful purpose so that they could identify the body of my brother after the war, because Moncion lost his whole family in concentration camps and then was an orphan on the streets of Paris and seems to have had this kind of like exchange of knowledge with Debord where, and this is my interpretation of it, but these kids were free of the bourgeois structures of French society because they had lost everything. And they're like learning how to thieve and learning how to steal liquor and living on the streets. And Guy Debord is, engaged to be married and has an apartment and his girlfriend has a job. And he's teaching them that they have a political subjectivity. So I guess it just seemed more dramatic to me than melodramatic to think about somebody with a life like that and to kind of secretly ferret these details from one real person into a fictive person, because I think maybe I want that history to continue, to think about the sort of Debord effect and the people who witnessed, who knew up close, who remember and who can tell, So it could seem melodramatic to somebody else, but to me, it was just interesting. Yeah. No, I understand completely. But I was just thinking like, how do I avoid? I'm not sure. I think it's just like, I have to believe it. But, it's an accretion of things I've been interested in and thinking about for many years, rather than just latching onto a story sort of impetuously. I don't know. Thank you.
And I think I can speak for everyone that I feel smarter for having heard this conversation for the last hour.
I don't want to hold anybody captive, but can you tell us really quickly what your new book is about?
Oh, God. It's actually really, really long. So I don't think it's actually a book that people will read for the most part, but it's basically about the changing structure of the global economy and in its entirety, especially in the 2010s and the 2020s, with a particular focus on the changing valences of political subjectivity and how they relate to productive subjectivity, so the types of work that people do. But the short description is basically, it's a horror story about global capitalism in, you know, I pitch it as like if H.P. Lovecraft wrote Capital, basically.
That sounds awesome. I mean, yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah.
But I'm excited for that. And
Yeah, it should be out. Oh, it's called Hell World. So I guess that does give a bit of the tone, and it should be out next year. If all the editing goes smoothly, I think end
Yeah.
of next year through the historical materialism series, which is originally through Brill and then through Haymarket in the U.S.
Maybe we'll see you here again.
Yeah,
yeah, we'll reverse roles.
yeah, that'd be fun.
Another round of applause for. our
Thanks, everyone.
speaker.